It's an honor to be here, and it's a special honor to get to share my precious church family with you. Thank y'all so much for leading us in worship today. The young man stood anxiously before his Kentucky congregation after delivering his trial sermon. The young man believed that he had been called to preach, but according to Baptist tradition at that time, it was the congregation who would have the final say. So he stood nervously and awaited the verdict of the people who had heard him. And after an awkward silence, one man arose, cleared his throat, and said, "Well, considering that God is omnipotent, that means that God has all power. He can do whatever he wants. He can even do the impossible. Considering that God is omnipotent, I suppose he could make a preacher out of him." So it's good theology, Dr. Green, but not exactly a ringing endorsement. Nobody there that night could have guessed that the young man would become one of the most important Baptists of the 19th century, a shaper of American Christianity, and Union University's most controversial president. On this Founders Day, I want to take just a few moments to introduce you to a true giant of Union's past, James Madison Pendleton. God did make a preacher of J.M. Pendleton. In about 1837, he was the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Bowling Green, Kentucky. But for our purposes today, it was in 1852 that his life really began to get interesting. That's when he made the acquaintance of another colossal figure from Union's past, James Robinson Graves. You can really hardly talk about Pendleton without talking about Graves, and vice versa. J.R. Graves was a wildly popular Baptist preacher and newspaper editor in the antebellum South. He was a man with a truly epic beard and an even bigger personality. The antebellum South was a time when denominations were cutthroat in their competition for souls in every town, and they didn't try to hide it. It was a time when theological debates could draw massive crowds. Imagine spending your Friday night with thousands of your closest friends to hear a debate between the Methodist preacher and the Baptist preacher on the finer points of predestination. It's the kind of day that they lived in. It was a time when mudslinging, name-calling religious literature was eagerly gobbled up in every frontier town. And in this context of Bible brawls, J.R. Graves stood out as the most aggressive, the most flamboyant, and the most effective communicator of the age. One man said that he was a knight clad in full armor. He stood in the arena, a Samson among the Philistines. When he unshackled the sword, he threw the scabbard away because victory or death closed his battles. He took no prisoners. J.R. Graves loved a good fight, and he would fight you about just about anything, but he especially loved to fight about the church. J.R. Graves believed that since Baptists alone followed Christ's New Testament model of church order, that Baptists comprised the only true churches. Graves argued further based on Matthew 16:18. That's Christ's promise that the gates of hell will not prevail against his church. Graves promised based on that verse that Jesus had preserved his true Baptist churches all throughout history against all the forces of hell. J.R. Graves, when he stood in his Baptist congregation, he envisioned a great unbroken chain stretching all the way back to that very first Baptist meeting, the one at the Jordan River where John baptized Jesus. And so for J.R. Graves, other denominations were not just in error, they were illegitimate. He denied the concept of a universal church, of all believers everywhere in all times and all places bound together in the same body. He said there were only local churches in the New Testament, and if a local church isn't biblically ordered, then it's no church at all. It's just a religious society, he said. Now, this stuff was also plain to J.R. Graves, but he feared that his Baptist contemporaries were losing their grip on these important truths. And there were three practices among Baptists that particularly troubled Graves. The first was alien immersion. I need a lot of participation. Can y'all say alien immersion with me? Alien immersion. I know that sounds kind of far out, but what that means is Baptist churches accepting church members who had been baptized, even immersed as believers, but in non-Baptist churches. Alien immersions are out, he said. The second practice that troubled him was open communion. Say it with me. Open communion. That's Baptist sitting down to the Lord's table with non-Baptists, those who had not been baptized in Baptist churches. The third practice, last time I'll make you talk, pulpit affiliation. Say it with me. Pulpit affiliation. You can impress your friends over the weekend with all that you've learned today. Pulpit affiliation is when Baptist churches invited non-Baptist preachers into their pulpits. To J.R. Graves, these practices violated God's word. They confused God's people. They damaged Baptist witness to the world, and they hindered true unity in the truth. And so in 1851, he called Baptists together to renew their commitment to a consistent Baptist practice in a very historic meeting that took place like 15 miles from this chapel, a place called Cotton Grove, Tennessee. I've been there myself. I can take you sometime if you want. Cotton Grove, Tennessee. Many cheered on Graves' Cotton Grove resolutions. Many more despised Graves' Cotton Grove resolutions, but everyone was talking about them. This controversy was in full blaze when J.M. Pendleton invited Graves to hold a series of revival meetings at First Baptist Bowling Green. And Graves agreed to come, but when he sat down with Pendleton there in Bowling Green, he was scandalized to find that Pendleton accepted alien immersions in his church. And he rose to leave. Now, I find this really interesting because had Pendleton allowed Graves to walk out the door that day, J.M. Pendleton's life and Union's history would look very different. It's amazing how our lives turn on such small hinges. History reminds me of that all the time. But J.M. Pendleton prevailed on J.R. Graves to stay. Graves remained, and he led a remarkable revival in that church over the next month. 74 souls were added to the church. They had to build a whole new building just to fit all these new people who'd gotten saved. And with those kinds of results, it may not be surprising that Graves also converted J.M. Pendleton to his strict Baptist policies. And before long, Pendleton was defending these policies himself in print. In one sermon that's been reprinted many, many times since then, Pendleton declared, "Where there is no baptism, there are no visible churches. There is no baptism among paedo-Baptists, those who sprinkle babies. Therefore, there are no visible churches. Where there are no visible churches, there is no gospel authority to preach. There are no visible churches among paedo-Baptists, therefore there is no authority to preach. It follows then," landmarkers loved this logic, "it follows then that Baptists ought not to recognize paedo-Baptist preachers as gospel ministers." It's not exactly together for the gospel. He wasn't loading up the church vans to go to Passion at the beginning of the year, if you know what I mean. He wasn't down with the community Thanksgiving service where we all hold hands and sing, "Blessed be the tie that binds." That's not J.M. Pendleton's scene. And he knew it was spicy stuff. And he'd take some heat for it, but he was willing to take the heat for it. He just dug in his heels. He said, "Some faint-hearted Baptists may say that if the sentiment advocated by the writer is made practical, it will bring great unpopularity and odium on the Baptist denomination. This objection is scarcely worthy of consideration. The question refers not to unpopularity and odium, but to right and truth." It was Pendleton who coined the name for this strict Baptist policy that we've been describing, landmarkism. I was kidding earlier, say it with me. Landmarkism. That's really, really important. That comes from Proverbs 22:28. "Remove not the ancient landmark which thy fathers have set." The legendary landmark partnership of Pendleton and Graves, it would alter the course of Baptist history, and it would bring Pendleton to Union University. Located in Murfreesboro, Tennessee at the time, Union was founded, this manifestation of Union was founded as a Baptist school, friendly to all evangelical students and churches and causes, and its name Union kind of suggests that, doesn't it? But J.R. Graves wanted to tighten things up a little bit at Union. And when he moved to Nashville in 1845, Graves inserted himself into every Baptist institution in Tennessee. So he joined the First Baptist Church of Nashville. he became the editor of the Tennessee Baptist newspaper, which everybody read at that time. He built circulation up to about 13,000 readers at the time of the Civil War. And he got his foot in the door at Union by becoming a trustee, a position that he would hold for over 40 years. By the mid-1850s, Graves, the trustee, had raised money for an endowed chair of theology at Union. Guys, theology professors have been stirring up trouble at Union from the very beginning, Dr. Green. An endowed chair of theology. And for Graves, of course, there could only be one choice: J.M. Pendleton. Now, Union's trustees, they approached him about this, and Pendleton at first, he demurred. He hadn't been to university, and he said, kind of this all-shucks way, I just learned all my theology from the Bible. Those are the ones you got to watch, Dr. Van Ness. I just learned all my theology from the Bible. Well, of course, they ate that up. That's just what they wanted, and Pendleton was installed in 1857. And at Union, Pendleton immediately threw himself into the landmark crusade. It began in the classroom, where he taught some 50 students 5 hours a day. Now, because he had never been a professor before, he had to work frantically to keep ahead of the syllabus. Quote, marvelous to say, I had to teach many things of which I knew absolutely nothing, except what I'd learned myself without the aid of anyone. I had, therefore, to go ahead of the classes. And it's a wonder to me to this day how I was able to conceal my ignorance so as to avoid the ignominy of exposure. Pendleton also accepted the pastorate of the First Baptist Church of Murfreesboro and claimed it for landmarkism. He served as associate editor of Graves's Tennessee Baptist newspaper, which, again, everybody was reading at that time. And in the pages of that paper, Pendleton sharply attacked Methodists, Presbyterians, Churches of Christ, Anglicans, Roman Catholics, and maybe especially those Southern Baptist brethren who didn't get on board with the landmark agenda. Pendleton and Graves nearly split the Southern Baptist Convention in two over landmarkism during the 1850s. They did split First Baptist Nashville. In an ugly public controversy, the church ended up excommunicating J.R. Graves. And he promptly moved across town, started a new church, and declared it to be the true First Baptist Nashville. Pendleton, in the pages of the Tennessee Baptist, called on the Southern Baptist Convention to refuse seats to messengers from that old poser First Baptist Nashville. Pendleton's activism in all of this, though, it took a physical toll. He said, I did too much for any mortal man to do. My body would probably have sunk under the mental strain if I had not taken active exercise on my little farm. I often plowed by way of recreation in the afternoon, something to consider if you're feeling a bit run down this semester. Well, Pendleton's burdens only increased in 1859 when Union's first president, Joseph H. Eaton, died suddenly at age 46. I can't imagine what stress he might be experiencing overseeing this faculty. After Pendleton delivered the tearful funeral sermon for Eaton, trustees asked him to succeed Eaton as president, and so his influence expanded. From Nashville, the pastor of that First Baptist Church I mentioned, R.B.C. Howell, he was a founding trustee of Union, and he was landmarkism's bitterest enemy. He grumbled that after Pendleton moved to Murfreesboro, landmarkism became the hobby of Union faculty and students alike. It was true that under Pendleton, the school looked less like the old Union and more like landmark headquarters. President Pendleton discouraged students from attending non-Baptist revival services and religious meetings, which had been common practice before then. He discouraged them from shopping at non-Baptist-owned stores in town. And most importantly, he put the kibosh on dating non-Baptist girls. Union's name began to sour in the broader evangelical community, and enrollment began to decline, but Pendleton shaped a generation of students through his strong landmark views. In turn, these students would wield tremendous influence in the Baptist South for decades to come, but it would be another controversy that cut Pendleton's tenure short. Despite his Southern breeding, J.M. Pendleton was a staunch supporter of the federal union at the time of the war between the states. In the 1840s, he had argued in a series of 20 newspaper articles for the gradual emancipation of slaves in Kentucky, although Pendleton himself owned a slave at the time of the war. Pendleton vocally opposed secession throughout the late 1850s. And when the war finally did break out, he preached against Baptist boys serving in the Confederate Army unless they were serving as chaplains. When the Confederate flag was hoisted at the Rutherford County Courthouse, Pendleton turned his back, calling the stars and bars, quote, utterly distasteful to me. Well, Pendleton's politics alienated him from nearly everyone in his life. The Southern press vilified him as a venomous reptile, a perverter of the truth, a false teacher, and pressured Union to fire him. You thought the media was rough today. That's what he was dealing with. The First Baptist Church of Murfreesboro grew so disgusted with their pastor that Pendleton finally resigned in 1861. Union's enrollment plummeted during this time. The school was forced to close also in 1861. Even Pendleton's own son, Robert, turned his back on him and joined the Confederate Army. He would be killed in action, and Pendleton never mentioned him in his autobiography. Even Pendleton's landmark collaborator, J.R. Graves, his ride or die, deserted him. Graves came to Murfreesboro and pleaded with Pendleton for 4 hours to change or at least mute some of his strong political opinions for the good of landmarkism. And when Pendleton refused, Graves removed him from the Tennessee Baptist editorial board. Suddenly, J.M. Pendleton was the most hated man in Murfreesboro. That was a dangerous spot to be in at the time because Murfreesboro was a rugged frontier town. Union students were killed in drunken brawls in the court square and shot to death over shoe repair bills. It was just a rugged kind of a place. And Pendleton daily feared lynch mobs storming his house, and so his wife would keep a knapsack of food freshly packed and set by the back window in case her husband had to make a fast escape. Only the promise of divine protection kept Pendleton sane in these years. One afternoon while plowing those fields, Pendleton testified to seeing himself encircled by fiery demons, all of them gnashing their teeth, grasping for him, trying to get at him. I'll have to ask Dr. Oliver. That may just be another day at the office for a college president. But this is what Pendleton saw himself. Yet far above, God sat enthroned and declared, "You can't touch him unless I permit." This strengthened Pendleton for a time, but eventually even this vision of divine protection couldn't keep him in Murfreesboro. He placed his wife and children in a carriage driven by Union student G.W. Welch, bound for Ohio. And a few days later, Pendleton followed incognito by another route. Stopping off in Nashville, he secretly received some 30 letters with Union intelligence to be mailed in Bowling Green. Pendleton's flight ended his brief, stormy tenure as Union's president and severed all ties with the university. He said, "I remember waking the next morning after he left Tennessee before the day and bursting into tears under the impression that the Lord had nothing more for me to do and that there was no place for me in his vineyard," he wrote. But he was wrong. Pendleton would settle in an affluent Philadelphia area church. That was the hub of American Baptist life at the time, and he would spend the rest of his career there in Upland. Later, he would help to found Crozier Theological Seminary, the future alma mater of Martin Luther King Jr. He also took full advantage of the American Baptist Publication Society that was located there in Philadelphia. It was kind of sort of like the Lifeway of its day, and he became one of the most prolific authors in Baptist life. He produced all kinds of books, many of which are still in print today. I received a little copy of the Baptist Church Manual by J.M. Pendleton when I became a pastor. Pendleton never renounced his landmarkism, though he did cease to make it an issue after he moved to the North, where that kind of denominational feuding was out of fashion. But Pendleton had forever left his mark on Union, and the school would continue to be one of the most significant disseminators of landmark teaching in the entire country through the end of the 19th century, long after they relocated to Jackson in 1874 to merge with Jackson Mill Academy. Alumni from Union would extend the landmark legacy of Union from countless Baptist pulpits across the South each week. They would agitate for landmark consistency in the pages of Baptist newspaper, and they would stir major denominational controversies at the state and national levels. It was a Union alum and a missionary to China, T.P. Crawford, who very vocally broke away for the Southern Baptist Convention's Foreign Mission Board, the formerly what was the International Mission Board. He broke away from that to form a more landmark-friendly gospel mission movement. In another controversy, one Union alum landmark pastor and newspaper editor T.T. Eaton, the son of Union's first president, Joseph Eaton, he successfully led a movement to unseat the president of Southern Seminary, a non-landmarker and fellow Union alum, William H. Whitsitt. Whitsitt's crime? Denying the landmark claim of an unbroken succession of Baptist churches throughout history. Still grumbling from Nashville, RBC Howell. Never has a cause so feeble resulted in a disaster so lamentable. J.M. Pendleton's controversial Union career suggests several lessons. Positively, those old landmarkers, for all their faults, they do remind us that the local church is really important. They invested a lot of passion, a lot of energy into talking about, thinking about, and serving local churches. They do remind me of the centrality of the local church and God's purposes in the Christian life. For all of their errors, they were passionate about the local church, and y'all, we should be too. If we love the Lord, we should love his church and be honored to serve her and give our lives to her. They also remind us that we should care deeply about obeying the commands of Christ, even those not essential to salvation, like baptism. Wherever you come down on the issue of baptism, we're all obligated as followers of Christ to open up the Bible as God's word and wrestle with the truth that he has revealed. And once we've determined and as clearly to us as we can what Christ requires of us, we're called to obey that. And they remind me to do that. And I will say this too. Again, he seemed to enjoy controversy a little too much, as we'll get to, but his willingness to be unpopular for his convictions, it's challenging to me because I love to be loved. I like to be liked. And there are times when we should be willing to be unpopular for the truth. And at the same time, of course, Pendleton offers several warnings about the fine line between passion for truth, passion for Jesus, and just passion to prove yourself right. Just passion to show that you're the smartest person in the room. He teaches us about the unhealthy craving for controversy and quarrels that seem to tempt Christ's servants in every age. I was reading in 2 Timothy this morning, and it's amazing how often Paul urges Timothy and those who would follow him that the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome. And I said, I don't know about you, but I find that when I'm paying attention to my own heart before the Lord, the family that God's entrusted to me, the ministry he's called me to at my church, whatever your job, when I'm just focusing on that, I've got all I can say grace over, as my granny would say. And yet there is this seductive pull to develop a larger public platform rather than focusing on everyday faithfulness, loving and serving the actual real-life people around you, and that includes getting along with the actual real-life people around you. He reminds us about the call that we do need to pursue obedience to Christ in all areas, including baptism, including church matters, while remembering, though, that it is the gospel that is the matter of first importance, and that we should celebrate the Lord's good work among those even with whom we disagree. I'm so grateful that when I was a student at Union University, that's where I first heard the names of some great Baptist servants of Christ from days gone by. But it's also the place where I was introduced to brothers and sisters who've enriched my life, like the letter writer and Anglican John Newton, great Presbyterian preacher and theologian B.B. Warfield, and on it goes. Francis Asbury, the great Methodist circuit rider at Union, in my time served me well by helping me go deep in the Baptist tradition while also giving me a great love for the great tradition of that universal church to which I belong. I am grateful today for all the saints. So the question as we come to a close then is, can we learn from Pendleton? Can we reject his foibles and failures while also holding fast to what is good in his example? Well, as God is omnipotent, meaning he has all power and he can do even impossible things, as God is omnipotent, perhaps he could help us to be faithful in that way. I thought it might be most helpful to close with what I think are Pendleton's finest words from his Union career. They come from his funeral sermon from Joseph Eaton, in which he described the first president's final moments in this world. This is what Pendleton says. But I heard the dying whisper of the man of God saying, "Tell the students, I wish them all to be Christians. What would they do in my situation without religion? Pendleton says, young men, here is a strong proof of the president's love for your souls. As the dying hour drew near, as the light of eternity began to dawn upon him, you might have supposed that the interest of his own salvation would monopolize all his thoughts, but it was not so. He thought of you. He loved you, and he sent his dying message to you. Tell the students, I wish them all to be Christians. Now that's a landmark I can get behind. Thank you very much.